Thanks first of all to Jan for inviting me here and allowing me to meet all of you. I was triggered, as Jan knows, by the very title of the conference and the link between utopia, something I worked upon in the past, and constitution in the EU context. So, well, what I do in this paper, and if the slides don't work, we don't need them at all. Oh, it's off. Okay, yeah, that helps. So basically, the claim I make is a very broad claim, is to say that the European Union, in fact, shouldn't re-engage with utopia, but should rather try and emancipate itself from some of its utopian legacies from its two founding moments. And that I do in three parts. First, you need to chew a little bit on concepts briefly of utopia and constitution. Then I look more in detail at these two founding moments of 1950 and 1989. And thirdly, in that perspective, I look at our current situation and predicament. Well, as some of you know, I'm not speaking as a lawyer. I'm speaking as a political theorist and historian. So if, as the saying goes, there are two kinds of books, there's legal books and books on the law. I hope this paper clearly is not going to be a legal paper, but you can judge at the end whether it is a paper at least on the law, about the law. Now, on these two basic notions, first on utopia, which it doesn't show in the paper and it doesn't have to, but it's something I worked upon in the past in a completely different context. And I spent a whole year reading kind of utopian novels and all kind of things. And my conclusion from that was that it's useful and important to distinguish utopia from just any ideal or form of idealism or aspirational scheme, and to try and circumscribe a little bit what utopia means. And there, an author which inspired me to do that is a utopian author himself, who knows that, Ernst Bloch, his great trilogy from 1918 and a bit after, Geist der Utopie. And there you can, or I draw the conclusion that basically there's three features which characterize utopias. And first, most clearly, they offer a clean break with the past. And that's going to be key also in the EU context. Secondly, and that's more obvious, they talk about a collective, about a we. It's not an individual program. And thirdly, there also is an element of faith involved. So it's not just that you can dream about a great future or eternal peace or abundance. You also have to believe that this is possible. And I think that is very relevant as well. Now, in a way, well, this is very, very sketchal and perhaps superficial or pedestrian, but the Constitution is a little bit of a counter concept. Depending on how you look at it, again, I come to this more as a political theorist and historian. So, of course, what constitutions do and have to do in our democratic societies is be an embodiment and warden of individual rights, democratic representation. And that is key, but if we only have that prism, looking at the EU, you risk ending up with a kind of eternal longing and complaining because it's never good, it's never enough. And perhaps to look at the EU with a constitutional eye, one could be a little bit more modest and think of a constitution as, and here it's Raymond Aron as one author who looks at it that way, basically as a system of rules to be able to deal with different and conflicting ambitions and conflicts in a given society. So to to deal with conflicts and also to deal with historic change. And in a way that is anti-utopian, in the sense that, of course, most utopias are built against the very idea of conflict. They're about harmony. They're about a kind of historic end state where things would end. Now, with that in mind, we can look at Europe's two founding moments, for sake of symmetry, called After the War and After the Wall, 1950 and 1989. The first one, I'll spend a bit more time on that, is of course crucial. And what I stress there is that of these three elements, of course, the first one, the new Europe as a clean break with the past, was dominant and was also giving in a way the courage and the deep political will of the EU's founding fathers to do that, to do something completely unheard of and new, this sentiment of never again. They did that, of course, with a completely new set of institutions, but also, and this is then closer to the field of sociology of law, things like that, or the history of the EU, with rhetoric, with developing a new vocabulary, a way of thinking at Europe. And I try to, again, all this is of course very much zooming out, but to understand this in terms of the promise these founders made to themselves, to their public opinions, and which also had as a reverse side of the medal a certain number of taboos, which some are still with us. Of course, the key promise, I don't have to go into details here, is that law would replace politics, power politics, as expressed also in certain institutional methods, community methods, which again was needed, this belief, to make this jump into a new institutional system and organization of interstate relations, but also over time, in my view, became a kind of orthodoxy against which it was no longer possible to criticize it. Now, I think what is very important also for basically for the way the European Union's legal and constitutional, to some extent political self-image developed, is this break with the past. Of course, in 1950 there was nothing. You could say we don't want the world we had before, world wars, etc. We want something new. And it's a grand vision of a continent at peace with itself. But of course, it was nothing. I mean, these men, mainly men, they were building a market for coal and steel, very prosaic enterprise. Does not inspire the masses. So they needed really a big leap of faith there, a big claim on the future with a very big promise on what this would be. And hence, I think, a tendency, a very fundamental tendency to always think in terms of becoming. Things are never what they are. They're always about becoming. By contrast, if something is not the case, then there is a very strong tendency until today that something is not yet the case. The Czech Republic is not yet a member of the Eurozone. In Brussels, they can't simply say that it's not. They always say not yet. Well, there also, Christian, there's also this whole vocabulary of convergence and harmonization. It's always about movement, and I think that is linked this tendency to this founding moment, and it also explains, by the way, the existential shock of Brexit, right? Because something was happening which was not supposed to happen. Right? It was going in reverse, right? So, sorry, of course it doesn't work there. Now, on these two other utopian elements, I think there was, and to some extent still is, an obligation to believe. The French around de Gaulle felt this very deeply. They were very irritated by it, by this supranational theology. The French foreign minister called it that way. De Gaulle himself spoke about utopia in the context of in the 1960s. And linked to that is a reduction of the we. We Europeans in the 1950s, 60s, 70s was not the inhabitants of the continent or citizens of member states. No, we Europeans was we who believe in Europe, we who build Europe, the artisans, the avant-garde of Europe. And that you can still feel that, including, we can discuss this later, but including in positioning, for instance, of, we discussed this over dinner last night, President Macron, right? It's we the good Europeans against those who are not European. And just as in 1960s they said de Gaulle was not a European, although he was a French president, today there are others who are said that they are not Europeans. Now, on the other side of the medal, there's a certain number of taboos, defense mechanisms. One is more to the heart of the field of constitutional law. This thinking in terms of sui generis. Europe is special. Europe is unique. So our basically the whole great tradition of Western or European constitutional thought does not apply. I'm exaggerating, but it is that worked as a defense, both in vis-à-vis the public, because it's an appeal to complexity, which and against intelligibility, a great word, difficult to pronounce, but here I'm fully with Paul, because that's a key feature a constitution should do. It's offer intelligibility, and if you say this is just complex, you're doing the opposite. And sui generis also helped lawyers around the EU institutions to fend off difficult questions about separation of powers and things like that. Now, there are a certain number of taboos, taboo on national interests, taboo on talking about difference in power, and member states are supposed to be equal, and taboo on thinking about borders, all these political issues, border, conflicts, etc. This was part of the depoliticization operation. Now, I just have 2 or 3 minutes left, and as I said, I won't spend much time about on the year 1989, but what is interesting, and I write it in more detail in the paper, is that this big shock of the fall of the Berlin Wall in a way was a first moment when these taboos were challenged, when this promise was challenged, but it was at the same time what I call a return of history moment, return of war and peace in Europe, but also it was understood very quickly as another utopian moment, as another end of history in a new version. And hence what you get in EU discourse is that this, to me, fundamental change, which from the community to the union, has been denied, both doctrinally, and here I mention the way there was a taboo put on Angela Merkel's idea of union method. It's a very interesting episode. We can discuss it later, but she was not allowed to say that the situation had changed, to use new words, because she was going against the sacred community method. And although she was at the height of her power, this is exactly 8 years ago, November 2010, in Bruges, there was just, she was accused of sacrilege, basically, by using that very word. So you can see that some of these taboos have a very long life, and they deny a new and better understanding of the union as it is today, which is not what it used to be. And of course, the change was also denied because we thought that history, or some history, had stopped. Now we have, in a way, we have a second chance, a second shock moment, which is one can summarize it as, encapsulate it as the moment of Trump, or a realization that the European Union is in a living history in an aggressive environment with difficult neighbors. We are not, as we thought we were in 1950, the avant-garde of world peace, nor leading the rest of the world on the way to the end of history, as even George Bush's father said, still in 1990. No, we are, frankly, under pressure. And this idea of sovereignty, I don't stress it enough in the paper, but that it's still very ambiguous, because and I'll conclude on that, and then if you allow. At the same time, it expresses this anti-utopian consciousness of history is back, or as the German former foreign minister put it, Sigmar Gabriel, the world is full of carnivores, we can't be the only vegetarians here. There's that. Well, that's very relevant and interesting that he says that in Germany. In that respect, this idea of European sovereignty expresses a need to think in political terms about border, about hard politics, also about democracy, again, something which got lost and which is very clear to Macron. But at the same time, you can feel already in Brussels, and I think Mike mentioned it also in his paper, that Juncker's last State of the Union, in a way, tried to also grasp this idea of European sovereignty, but then filling it with all the old stuff, with the QMV and foreign policy and old federalist thinking. And I think that is, well, I would say personally, a pity and a shame, because it, again, it hides the fact that it is a real new historic moment, and that if you just reduce this idea of European sovereignty to new packaging paper for old utopias, it will end badly for all of us. Now, perhaps I should stop here.
That's an idea.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
So, Forzo, we might. How hard pressed are we for time? Are we all right?
There's some lenience because we get lunch just over there, so we can be a
so
little bit
we
over
have
time.
full 20 minutes for and let's
No, thank you very much. All needed. Now, all our disciplines are somehow coming to an end, and the historian study. You observe this even when you look at the literature on the monetary union. There are two big narratives now. Robert Too's Crash, it's called. 800 pages of Crash.
Adam Tooze.
Tooze, yeah.
Yeah, Adam Tooze.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, you're a historian.
Yeah.
You know this better. But what I really find now, it's so interesting that not only the historians move in, because somehow we all know that there is a dimension lacking in the individual disciplines. And at the same time, you observe, and they tell us very different stories. In your case, you start 1945. This, Tony Judd would do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
The Holocaust is the identity of Europe. He says, okay, that is about the same. But then you mentioned Brexit, and there you have a guy called Milvold, and he said, or in the last part of his book, You have a chapter on the UK, and it's basically a chapter predicting Brexit. If you read it now with hindsight, of course, he did not predict Brexit. Historians should not do that, but he mentions so many elements of the British tradition that it becomes clear to you that somehow this will pop up one day. And then you have now, which you did not mention, which I would mention, not 1989, but 1992, MU, the Economic and Monetary Union, or the aftermath. Okay, I'm saying we love the historians, but we are in the same kind of problem, that we are confronted with very competing visions of what Europe is and what is important in the European development. The last guy I really admire is Ashoka Modi, who has written a book on the crisis, the history of the crisis. He is an economist who knows how important it is to see economic policy making and monetary policy embedded in all these political processes. And it is so good because it's from India. And he can write, he can criticize Germany and Italy at the same time, and that is probably very, very helpful. Okay, I'm saying it is good, but what I expect when you deliver your final paper is that you tell us why you choose which element, and if you may even contrast it with other narratives, historical narratives.
With other historical narratives.
Yeah. Same problem that we all have. But
no, of course here it's true. I present in a way my own thinking as it has evolved without clear foils of contrast. I could say just a few words. Tony Judd's book, Post-War, has been indeed important to me because it was the first overall story, I think, of European post-war history, which did two things. One is he was able, perhaps Norman Davies is only the other historian, but able to talk about Western and Eastern Europe at the same time in one overarching narrative. And secondly, he was perhaps the first, books from 2005, to understand also that the whole Cold War, 45 until 89, was a parenthesis basically of the Second World War. And there also he had the advantage of historic distance, and so I'm in a way I'm indebted to Judd in that respect. One sentence on EMU. It's not here. I subsume it in a way under the 1989 moment. You can call it 1992, you can call it 1989, but you and I know that the decision to launch an IGC, or Monetary Union, was taken 1 month after the fall of the Berlin Wall in December 1989 at the Strasbourg European Council, and we can have a long debate or whether that was an explicit or an implicit quid pro quo between German reunification and the European currency. We don't have to do that debate here, but to those who decided that there was a clear link present in the room between the moment of historical acceleration with the end of communism and the need, let's say, Ashoka Modi also writes about it, to tie Germany, the German economy, closer to that of its neighbors, and the full expression of that was the euro, or at the time called the European currency without a name yet. To me, that is part of the shift between the old community market building operations, although it was not seen at the time, because in the Brussels thinking there was the idea that the euro was just a market with just a further step of market integration, that involving free movement of capital, and was just an extra step. And it wasn't one market, one currency was a big paper of the European Commission in 1990. One market, one currency. So we're just going to add a piece to the machinery, and it was not seen that it was in fact a complete leap in terms of integration, requiring different forms of political decision making and of public conviction. And that we have only discovered in the past 10 years, I would say.
All right, so I have quite a
Okay.
lengthy list of, so if I could ask at least the people posing questions to be succinct, so
You can also ask me to be succinct. There's
well,
no problem.
You're the speaker. So
No. I'll try to be succinct.
So next up is Mike.
Thanks. Just briefly on carnivores and vegetarians, I was thinking of the extinction of the dinosaurs when, of course, the carnivores died out first. So maybe we should be, maybe we shouldn't ditch our vegetarianism too quickly. But that wasn't my.
No, it's a real question.
So before the war and after the war, you can flip it around. Right? After the Cold War, 1989, and it strikes me in your discussion of sovereignty, which I think is very interesting, and I'd like to know a little bit more about. We can identify the return of sovereignty. I'm going to try and trace this in my paper. It's actually, at least incipient. It's more prominent now, but it's incipient at least from Maastricht, with the reaction to Maastricht, most notably through the German Constitutional Court, but the return of nationalism more generally around Europe and the reactions to Maastricht. And I wondered whether you, well, firstly, whether you would agree with that reading, that actually this return is in the margins, but what we're seeing now isn't a sudden. I mean, Brexit is obviously a shock, but the material dynamic underneath the water has been bubbling up at least since Maastricht. And the question that I have about sovereignty to you is why is sovereignty anti-utopian? I mean, if we think about the concept of popular sovereignty, we can think what we like about what it might mean, but surely it has quite a strong utopian element.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for these stimulating questions, Mike. I agree with your first point, that the thinking and talking about sovereignty in the EU discourse in a way goes back to Maastricht, because it was seen, rightly so, as a political renewal, which required also a political and constitutional language in response. And I guess public opinions saw this perhaps even better and sooner than political leaders, what they had done. But for the most part, that language was on the side of those who opposed further European integration, be it the Bundesverfassungsgericht, be it the UK Parliament, be it the French right, as some bastions of thinking about sovereignty for the French in the Gaullist tradition. Whereas what Macron did was to turn that around and to claim the term for, let's say, the pro-European side of the argument. And I think there he was the first. And it is linked to the Brexit and Trump moment. The first time Macron uses was September 16, and then a big speech in Germany a few days before the Trump inauguration in January 2017. So basically he says, I'm not going to leave all this language, this important semantic field of thinking about sovereignty, about protection, about borders. Others have added to that. Only to the nationalists and those who want to destroy Europe. I'm going to claim that language for our project in order to make sure that survives. And I think that was rhetorically and semantically a very important move. And it is linked, I think, to a sentiment of vulnerability, if not to say mortality. The European Union, their leaders, experienced after Brexit and with Trump, more so than during the Euro crisis or the migration crisis. And why do I think that idea is utopian or anti-utopian? Sorry, because, well, in my way of thinking, it is linked with a conscience of return of history, with the need to be able to deal with danger, with unexpected events, and rather than with the end of history where we can all go to sleep and we only have to administer things instead of to govern people, as Saint-Simon said it 2 centuries ago. And so that's basically the reason. It's a different worldview.
Right, so we have 6 questions and 8 minutes. So I am going to abuse my privileges as moderator, and I will suggest that we take 3 questions, field 3 questions, then you answer those questions,
Good.
and so that way everybody gets to have their say. So Yuri, Hugo, and Jan are the first 3. So
Okay, very quickly, going back to Mannheim, he considers utopia to be the negation of reality. Yeah, reality is unbearable, we have to change it. To what extent today the utopian thinking about Europe has to consider European Union as part of the problem, and therefore it needs to any utopian project or even constitutional utopia, constitutional imagination, has to seriously deal not with more Europe, less Europe, Brexit in, out, but simply rethink institutional structures of the European Union. And the problem of the European structures is they can think only of more Europe, sovereign Europe. So it's almost like a necessary clash that we can see at the level of practical politics, but at the level of imaginaries and visions as well. Yeah, practical politics. Can you imagine in a federal statehood such as the United States that the federal government would tell the state of Texas, no, your budget isn't good enough. Go back to the drawing board and do better next time. And at the level of imagination, it's the same. Europe is a problem.
So Hugo.
First, thank you very much for your very inspiring paper. I had 2 points. The first was the question, and it was pretty much the same that Michael asked, so I'm not going to re-ask it. But if I might just add a short comment, it's a project of sovereign Europe that's not really working at the moment, neither in France or in Europe in general. But the second point, also very short, was more a historical comment. I was not completely convinced by your opposition between utopian dimension and constitution, especially in the case of European integration. I think in the beginning the idea that community law was sui generis and not, was something special, new. I'm not so sure it was opposed to constitutional thinking. I mean, as I understand it, the first target was international law, and they wanted to draw a line between community and international, and it could be constitutional. I mean, it became quite easily a constitutional interpretation, so maybe you could just clarify this.
Yeah, thank you, and I will go just straight to one question, one comment, and I'm very grateful for the paper because it really goes to the heart of what I want to do in my project. So the question is, it's not clear to me when you say that the EU needs to emancipate from a specific utopian legacy, so does it mean that you think that Europe needs some sort of utopia, but it must be a different kind of utopia, or do you argue that we just need to get rid of all utopia whatsoever so that we can proceed with the project? And the second, which is also related to what I want to explore in the project, and maybe it's just reading too much into the paper, but I find it quite striking that 1989 is represented by the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, it was in the television, it's very easy to touch. It's the moment which everybody remembers, but it was a sort of a coincidence. They opened the borders without really knowing what they were doing. Whereas in Central Eastern Europe, you had like Solidarity Movement, Charter 77, which I think to me would represent what was emancipatory about 1989. And I think it's again, once more, just West taking over for itself what happened in 1989 and making it part of its own imaginary of what was going on, just making the Easterners like bystanders who just somewhat were swayed away by what happened in history.
Thank you for these 3 points. Yuri, I think that's a very interesting issue you raise, and I think you're right. And pursuing your idea, probably the utopian energy is today on the side of those who want to destroy the European Union. They want a clean break with the past, and that is, and they have also a different language for it, and that is a danger. I'll leave it at that. Hugo, sovereign Europe is not working. No, indeed it's an aspiration, and fully right point taken on sui generis was first meant to protect thinking about EU from international law, but I think in the second stage it was also used to protect it from thinking in terms of separation of powers. What does it mean for the Council of Ministers or the Commission to be at the same time on the executive and the legislative? How to think about constituent power and all these kind of classic questions were easily brushed aside with the sui generis argument, and that is something I've seen happening in a way in practice as well in talking to Commission lawyers, and I really think it's their fig leaf, and it's also a power game in between the different interpretations of what's happening there. On the first point, probably that's imprecise language, because as has become clear, I'm not arguing for another utopia on the first point.
So all utopias altogether.
Yes. But that does not mean, as I said at the outset, that we cannot strive or we need an idea of the future, etc., but not utopias in the sense of clean break with the past and including an element of faith. Full stop.
All right,
On 1989, point taken, but I take that as an... I fully agree historically, but here it is meant as a marker. But I perhaps should be more aware that these markers then also lead their own lives. And thanks.
So next group of questions begins with Sander, goes to Morten, and finishes with Calypso.
Major difficulties to make this short here. Okay. I think I want to challenge you a little bit on ascribing this utopian element to the European Union. I'll give you two counterexamples. Mm-hmm. Critique of the Gotha program, Karl Marx. We are moving us from a society where each is given according to his abilities, to his contribution, to a society we will give each according to his or her needs. That's it. The new historical principle. Work, nobody has to work any longer. Work will be a need. From a burden, it will be transformed into a need. That's a break with the past. Ottmar Spann, Roman Catholic, fascist, Austrian philosopher. Liberalism has made people unhappy. We need to go back to a society where people are distinguished in different estates. This is how we ought to live together. Career available to all talents? Nonsense. We go beyond it. Utopian, a career break with the past. When I push market economies beyond the national boundaries, where's the new society that I create? Yes, there is utopian rhetoric in the European Union, but we shouldn't be fooled by the rhetoric of believing that it was indeed a utopian project. Okay, thanks.
That was admirable, I would say.
No, thank you for a great paper and a very thought-provoking paper. I'm a historian, and therefore my kind of reflection on this is rather whether I can fit what I know about the history of European integration with the kind of description you have of a utopian project, and then a certain realism that sets in, and then it ends with sovereignty, right? And I think it does not fit so well. So my question is a little bit, I think you overdo the utopian part, right? And you also, in a way, you overemphasize a little bit what European integration was, how revolutionary it was, right? The really revolutionaries in the late 40s were the European federalists. But the coal and steel community and the treaties of Rome were basically scaled down versions of that. Yes, it took certain original ideas, the idea that you would have independent supranational institutions that had real competences. That was, of course, a break with the League of Nations, if you like, of the past. And there was certain rhetoric around it, of course, because for continental politics, speaking about Europe was a good thing in voting-wise in the 50s. So what you create is perhaps, in historical practice, much less utopian, if you like. So what is a utopia? As far as I see it, what you call utopian is really a set of relatively fragile European institutions that from 58 particular onwards has to create what they would call Europe, right? That is the European Commission, the Court, the Parliament. And they worked really hard to self-empower themselves. And they did it through, for example, the development of the constitutionalization of European law, were very much on your page, that it was already constitutional from the moment, even though they call it something else for political reasons. So basically, there's a certain element of self-empowerment here when you create a certain European law, and a key, for example, procedures about what is the role of the Commission, etc., etc. There's also an element here with the community method. That's a strong norm that the supranational institutions try to impose on governments, saying that when you cooperate here, we try to find communitarian solutions where national interests should not ultimately be in the way, right? And small states and large states are equal, right? So I don't see that so utopian. It's rather a particular way of developing a European community, if you like, which is a far cry from real federalism, but at least there's some belief it would go that way, others no, not. On the other hand, then I think you underestimate a little bit that the state power had not disappeared. No, of course not. I would probably agree. That state, in a way, you can say, oh, they were involved in the European community, but I think integration historians now would say, why did it actually end with the Single European Act? Why did national leaders choose the community for the big relaunch in the 80s? That was not so self-evident, actually. It was a little bit by chance, almost. So what I'm saying here is that state power is there all the time. And with Copenhagen, the rise of Copenhagen in the 60s, the veto right, the European Council, that ends in the EU and the Maastricht Treaty, in a way that the state leaders take over the community, if you like, and turn it into a union, which is not only constitutional, but also involves new methods of coordination, etc., etc. So what I'm saying is that, and that leads to my question, I do not see such a, there's a battle going on about what the community, what the union should be. Should it be more communitarian? Should it be more great state power? But I think with your recommendation of going for sovereignty of state power, if you like, or recognizing that reality, you also recognize a reality where the big states in the future EU will make the decisions, where the small states will be increasingly relegated, where, let's say, the communitarian elements that were actually created, over time, that they will be more fragile and cracked, perhaps. So it's a different sort of Europe. Is that the reality you recommend us having to live with, if you like? Then I become even a utopian at the end. Yes.
All right, and over to you.
Yeah, back to sovereignty, and you were talking now about the state sovereignty, but on the other hand, the paper ends with this Macron idea of sovereign Europe. I was going to take my name out of the list when Yuri spoke. We had more or less the same point, but your answer led me to keep my name on the list, because your answer was to say, hey, the utopian energy these days is from those who want to destroy the EU. And you give us Macron as this great anti-utopian savior. Dare I say
No, I said he's very ambiguous.
Well, okay, he's more of a messiah than an anti-utopian. But then, to me, and I want to make a point about Macron and ask you a question, but the bigger point for the overall project, Jan is gone, but is how do we as legal theorists or political theorists avail ourselves to the real world out there of flying political proposals and discourse and language? And how do we do it critically if we are critical theorists, who most of us around this table are very wedded to a pluralist take and a critique of the dominant canon? And so, we have our Macron, this new notion of sovereign Europe, which you explained very well in terms of his intention, is to take away the appeal of sovereignty from the sovereignists and put it to serve the EU approach. But when he does that, he throws the baby with the bathwater, because he reinstalls the old binary, us versus them, sovereign Europe versus national sovereignty. Of course, he's French, so he's not going to, diss national sovereignty, but hugely contradictory. And I'm not sure why we should put our hopes in that formulation of sovereign Europe without being actually hypercritical. Because there are other ways of expressing Europe's return to history, its role in the world. Even the old French way of Europe puissance, to me, is better, but there are different ways of thinking. And that availing of sovereignty for the European level, I think we need to be hypercritical of.
Okay, thanks for these 3 final questions, comments. I'll try and be brief in the reactions. Alexander, and it's a bit true also for perhaps what Morten said. Well, of course, I don't think that the European Union as it existed or evolved is or was a utopia. What I'm talking about the mindset and the language of people who drove this forward, with indeed a mix of idealism, utopianism, and real belief in certain cases. I think of one of the right-hand man of Jean Monnet. As you know, he had many right-hand men, but one was a Dutch guy called Max Koonstam, who had been a war prisoner, a bit like Spinelli, and who really had a real belief in Europe as the avant-garde of world peace. He lived to be 102 years old, so he was still doing the rounds and evangelizing until 10 years ago. Right? And in terms of communication and explaining and the narrative of the European Union, that has been very powerful, and there has always been this utopian strand, and indeed it is not utopia of abundance, but one of peace. Huh? That's to come back to what your reference to Karl Marx. So that's also partly my response to Morten. Yeah, I know. I mean, that these were fragile institutions, and that's why I stress this element of language and of rhetoric claims as part of the power struggle, of self-empowerment, as you call it. I completely see that, and in that power struggle, this utopian promise is still used to delegitimize all the institutions, and this is something I have experienced firsthand when working for the European Council. Huh? It's when you go to the European Parliament as President of the European Council, Van Rompuy was my boss, you're just evil. You're just evil. Huh? And I think as constitutional thinkers and political theorists, we shouldn't buy that. We should also make the situation intelligible and readable, and see that indeed state representatives at all levels are part of Europe, which is, as I said, something Merkel tried to do with that famous Bruges speech, and she got ostracized, and then she backtracked again. So it is not as innocent in terms of language and narrative, and also constitutional self-understanding, as both of you suggest it is. Perhaps the real world, in terms of the revolutionizing Europe's economy, etc., it's all pretty limited. But in terms of how this thinking has infused, again, Europe's constitutional self-understanding, I think it is very important. And also think back at all the taboos I mentioned, this teleological dimension of always thinking in terms of becoming. The European Commission should become the government, so we're not allowed to even think that somebody else is taking decisions. I think that is something to keep in mind, and I think that is what I try to do, focusing on that more a narrative, conceptual, self-image level, and not a real-world level. Briefly on Macron, Calypso, I fully agree. He's ambiguous. That's what he does. He invents a term without making explicit, waiting for the situation to evolve, and his sovereignty is not clear whether it's a Habermasian or a Gaullist idea of European sovereignty, for instance, and that is something that has to become clear. And because otherwise he loses, I think, what he perhaps wanted to achieve with that. And as Hugo already said, it may just all fizzle out, which I think would be a pity. In terms of high hopes, it's not about high hopes, but again, analyzing the rhetoric and semantics, it's interesting that this happens now, after Brexit, after Trump, this term of sovereignty. There's a political battle going on between various schools of thought about who can fill that term in a credible manner with political proposals and action. And I think that is fascinating to watch. I'll leave it at that.